Nigeria's federal government has outlined its strategies for debt servicing and financing in 2024, with significant increases in both allocations compared to 2023. As part of its strategy for servicing its debt obligations in 2024, a total allocation of 8.490 trillion naira has been made. This figure represents a significant increase from the 8.250 trillion naira budgeted for debt servicing in 2023. As per the financing plan, the federal government has outlined its strategy with a total allocation of 9.178 trillion naira. These are contained in the budget details presented by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu to the National Assembly last week. And to further discuss this, I have with me in the studio Head Fixed Income and FX, Chapel Hill Denham Securities, Oladipo Ajayi. Good afternoon and thank you so much for joining me.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on.
All right, so the government plans to fund debt servicing through a combination of domestic and external borrowings. How do you think Nigeria would balance, domestic and external borrowing to ensure debt sustainability while continuing to borrow for debt servicing and also financing?
Well, if we look at it from this perspective, this year we didn't actually visit an international market to raise money. So invariably, most of the borrowings for this year were basically domestic borrowing. And of course, if we look at it, the best way for the Nigerian government to actually fund infrastructural development is to actually borrow locally. And one of the reasons why that makes a lot of sense is imagine borrowing $1 million in 2007. And then I remember what you would have gotten there would have been about 117 million. But when you're paying back now, you're paying like a 1 billion. So it doesn't make sense for you to actually want to borrow long time in international markets. It makes a lot of sense to borrow locally, and I think that's one of the things they actually focused on this year. But when you now look at it critically from the angle of the current crisis, FX crisis, it also means that we need FX liquidity to actually bring normality to the market. And I think that's one of the reasons why going to next year, they are looking at going into international market to borrow. But when you look at the volume of what they are borrowing, is not so substantial.
Okay. Now, the breakdown of the debt servicing allocation amounts to about 243 billion naira. Now, for a budget that we don't know where the fund, is actually going to come from, what do you make of the allocations and how will the government raise this cash?
So, if you at the beginning of the year, the government will actually drop a budget, expected revenue, and your expected expenditure. And if you look at most developing nations, tend to have something we call deficit budget. So it simply means that your expenses will outweigh your revenue. And this is nothing bad. It's nothing bad, but just that what are you using the money you are borrowing for is the key thing. Globally, United States is actually named the country with the highest level of borrowing. But yet, it's one of the most developed countries in the world. It simply means that they are borrowing to develop. So the key thing is that we're borrowing to develop, and that's just the concern. But if you look at the budget for this year, we have about 8.5 trillion to actually service debt. And out of that 8.5 trillion, you have 5.5 trillion. That's actually to service local debt and also to repay some of the holdings of the ways and means that was the last government to the central bank. And you have about 2.7 trillion to actually service foreign debt. And if you look narrow this thing back, based on what I mentioned earlier on, borrowing locally is better because the 2.7 trillion, if it was last year, it would have been around 1.6 trillion because then Naira to dollar was around 470 in the official window. But because you are now paying close to about 750 to 800, it means that you have to use more Naira to pay the same level of dollars that you are paying. So if you look at
is it possible for Nigeria to be able to manage the impact of these currency fluctuations?
Of course. The best way to manage this is to actually find a way to diversify your economy. You have to get to a level where there's little reliance on foreign inflows. Of course, Nigeria is not a country that actually prints dollars. It means that you have to generate the dollars that you actually expend. And if you now want to do that, since Nigeria is import dependent, it means that we also need to find a way to actually open door to exportations that will generate more FX cash flow to be able to meet our import need. if we continue to live in a situation whereby our imports outweigh our exports, we'll continue to have a level where the currency will continue to fluctuate like what we have now. So I'm sure the government knows very well that you need to actually diversify oil as a key source of FX revenue. You need to start looking at agriculture. Of course, they've been looking at agriculture, but we need to now look at it from another angle now. You have to look at it from more of mechanized farming than what we used to. And also, the tech world is also another word. Nigeria can actually leverage that, because in Nigeria, we have people that worked with US companies or foreign companies just within this country, and most of them work in the tech world. It means that it's a world that you can actually develop, and that will help you to actually generate more FX revenue into the country.
All right, now in line with some of the challenges that you've actually, brought to the fore when it comes to borrowings, that's the fluctuations of currency and also interest rates and, every other thing. As the government, pledges to prioritize debt servicing, what measures or even policies should Nigeria implement to manage the risks associated with these borrowings?
So the first thing I think we need to do is that we must be disciplined in terms of what are we really borrowing for. When you borrow for consumption, it's not the best way of borrowing. You must borrow to actually develop. Because when you borrow to develop your country, what that will mean is that it will translate to you generating more revenue, and that will mean that you have more capacity to actually repay. What excites me on this year budget is the fact that, of course, it's still budget, it's expectations. That the cost of servicing debt to our revenue is about 45%. It's something that makes a lot of sense to me, because when you look at where we're coming from, sometime this year in the month of March, we are close to about 98%. It means that 98% of what we generated as revenue was what we used to service debt for that quarter. So it doesn't make a lot of sense when you look at that from that perspective. So it simply means that government must borrow to actually develop. They must not borrow to actually spend for consumption. And at the same time as well, we need to be very careful of where we actually spend our money. And it's not a time for us to throw caution to the wind. It's time for us to be very conservative. If the government is telling the people that they should persevere, we should subsidy removal, we should endure, there's light at the end of the tunnel. The government also needs to demonstrate that. People must be able to see their attitude in them, so that people can understand truly that we are truly on a journey to a better Nigeria.
All right, well, thank you so much, Oladipo Ajayi, for joining me in the studio this afternoon to discuss this.
You're welcome.